It always comes back to baptism. Baptism is where it starts. In our New Testament letter today, in 1 Peter, we hear these words that we might appeal for a good conscience. And I wondered, what is a good conscience? Might it be to always remember, and firstly remember, that you are a child of God, made so by God's adoption of you? For Mark, the gospel writer, baptism is where it starts. Perhaps you already noticed that we are in the 9th verse of the first chapter of Mark. The first 8 verses are about John the Baptizer being in the wilderness, speaking of the one who is to come after him, and that he's not worthy even to stoop down and untie the sandals of the one who is to come. That's the first 8 verses. And then we come here to verse 9, where Jesus is baptized. For Mark, baptism is where it starts. There is no birth narrative in Mark, the first gospel that's written. Matthew and Luke have the birth narratives. For Mark, it starts at baptism. Who needs to talk about the fact that Jesus was born? Isn't it made obvious, he might say, by the fact that he comes into the wilderness where John the Baptizer is and allows himself to be baptized? In baptism, it is true that we remember both our humanity and our divinity. In baptism, we remember ourselves. In baptism, we are brought into the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, who was fully God and fully human. Now, this can be sometimes hard to remember. The gospel writer, Mark, is very brief on all of this stuff. So it's fun to revisit some other greats who wrote on who Jesus was, such as St. Ephraim the Syrian. St. Ephraim the Syrian lived in the 300s. He took up most of that century. And from his writings, this one entitled On the Holy Transfiguration, we can hear this struggle to recognize that Jesus is fully God and fully human, a concept that is so hard for us to hold within ourselves constantly. St. Ephraim the Syrian says, if Jesus was not flesh, whom did Joseph take and flee into Egypt? And if Jesus was not God, in whom were the words, out of Egypt I have called my son, fulfilled? If he was not flesh, whom did John baptize? And if he was not God, to whom did the Father from heaven say, this is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased? If he was not flesh, who fasted and hungered in the desert? And if he was not God, whom did the angels come down and serve? If he was not flesh, who was invited to the wedding in Cana of Galilee? And if he was not God, who turned the water into wine? I use my hands for flesh and God, indicating that within our minds we see these as two poles, and the space between them is hard to live into, so frequently we cling to one or the other for some sense of security and confidence that we know who God is. It seems to me that most people cling to the idea of Jesus being fully divine. I see in people a reverence, a respect, a recognition that this one, the Son of God, died for them. Understanding the full divinity of Jesus seems pretty easy to conceive. Maybe, though, you are more like Brother Sean Glenn, who wrestles with the idea of Jesus' humanity. Brother Sean Glenn is a brother with the Society of St. John the Evangelist, a monastic order, Episcopal monastic order in Cambridge. They have a retreat house that I highly recommend. They are the first Anglican order of monastics, the Society of St. John the Evangelist. And Brother Sean Glenn writes this in a reflection he does on the Incarnation. And I should tell you that he has already stated in this reflection that he came to the Christian faith as a young adult, that he could not conceive of Jesus in his growing up years. And he says this: "Looking back, I can see a number of reasons I balked at the idea that God could become human, or that a human could be God. Some of these reasons were emotional, grown from the seeds of my sense of shame at my own body, judgments about the bodies of others, or ways my culture had taught me to see and value bodies. No, I would think, how could the creator of the universe, if there was such a thing, become human? So frail, so limited, so full of rage and anger and spite. How could the divine come so close to something that makes foul smells and produces substances like urine and feces? Some of these reasons were intellectual, the result of my unfamiliarity with the gospel and Christian thinking through the centuries. Surely the great power of the Creator would completely overwhelm the tiny frailty of a human being. How truly human could this Jesus have been if he were also God?" He goes on to say, like the burning bush encountered by Moses, the incarnation reveals that God does not consume the fragile creature the nearer it comes, but instead makes the creature more beautifully what it is. It is hard for us to conceive of the beauty of humanity, that God would want to come close, to actually take up us, to limit God's self in the frailty of the human being. And so we skip over that when we read the Gospels frequently, and I chuckle to myself at reading Mark's Gospel. In 3 or 4 lines, he just gets through some stuff. Yeah, okay, he was baptized, and then, he went into the wilderness for 40 days and then came out, and then he goes to Galilee and does, ministry. And you're like, wow, isn't there more to that story? When we think about Jesus coming forward for his baptism, I don't know about you, but I consider that he knew that the heavens would open. I mean, I know that, I read it. But if we allow ourselves to enter the story as Jesus is being discovered, wouldn't that have been a surprise to him? He was simply following the direction that he felt within himself. When did Jesus become aware of God himself? Would he have known it when he was a child? A teenager? It seems to me that it was at his baptism that he got a hint. He too heard the words, "This is my son, my beloved, in whom I'm well pleased." He came up out of that water with as much limitations on his brain as we have, because that's what it means to be human. How could he have conceived of what would happen? And so he senses something working within him and follows the invitation to go out into the wilderness to consider what happened there. He needed to get away, perhaps. Don't you, after something big happens? Don't you want to clear your head and the area around you of sound and say, just a second, I just got to recalibrate here for a second. Something big has happened and I just have to catch my bearing. Jesus, as a human, wouldn't he have felt the same? And so he goes into the wilderness because something just happened. He heard this voice, "This is my son, my beloved, in whom I'm well pleased." And what does that mean? And so he's out here in the wilderness for a time of prayer and fasting, something that he's known, his tradition has encouraged when the confusion sets in or the mystery hints at you. We know that Jesus was in the wilderness for 40 days, but I want to remind you that the 40-day measure, or 40 in the Bible, is an indication of the fullness of time. Until it was finished. 40 is the number used to indicate it was as long as it needed to be. So when we think about Jesus in the wilderness, I think we misinform ourselves of who Jesus was in his full humanity, to assume that he knew when this would be over, to assume that he knew what these challenges would be as he prayed and fasted alone. I don't know about you, but when I'm going through a life-transforming event, I do not know where I'm going to end up. I have to just be with it for a while. in the comfort and in the strength of God, allowing God to lead me into what it is that God wants me to know. And so it is, I imagine, that it was with Jesus. Richard Rohr, a Franciscan priest and founder of the Center for Action and Contemplation in Albuquerque, New Mexico, speaks about this holy journey of discovery into the mystery of God that we know primarily in Jesus, who was fully human and fully divine. Richard Rohr is a globally recognized ecumenical teacher whose work is grounded in Christian mysticism. I was listening to his podcast, which is entitled Another Name for Everything, and was struck by these words. In dialogue with those who were interviewing him, he said, "Instead of service, we should be talking about solidarity, and then service will have an authenticity to it." I thought about God coming in solidarity with us humans. God's creation, we wouldn't exist without God the Creator. And God comes in solidarity with us in order that God's service might have some authenticity to it. Doesn't Jesus model this for us? It is in Jesus that we see that God became in solidarity with humanity. And it was in God's service, through God's solidarity, that we realize who Jesus is and who we are. We are made in his image, baptized into his life, death, and resurrection. This, as we follow Jesus, this is who we truly are. I want to pick up with St. Ephraim's sermon, if he was not flesh and if he was not God. Because I'm thinking about the stories that we will now read in the coming weeks. The ones I'm going to reference, we won't read all of them, but I think you'll recognize some of these. If Jesus was not flesh, who was it that touched the blind man's eyes? And if he was not God, who was it that made him to see? If Jesus was not flesh, who was it that was pressed in by the crowd? And who was it then that who the woman who was hemorrhaging touched if he was not flesh? And if he was not God, who was it that healed her from her 12 years of bleeding? If he was not flesh, who was it that took the bread and broke it with his hands? And if he was not God, who was it that fed the thousands on the hillside? If he was not flesh, who was it that was asleep in the boat while the waves tossed and turned the boat? Who was it that the disciples were angry with for being asleep when they were trying to keep their boat from going under? And if he was not God, who was it that calmed the storm? As the disciples follow Jesus, they start to get the sense of what this is, the mystery that he's inviting them into, the mystery that is more certain than any certainty we could ever know. And they begin then to see themselves differently. They know their full humanity, but they begin to discover the divinity that has been given to them in their creation. As they follow Jesus, they begin to see the Spirit that is within them. Jesus sends them out, as you well know, to do miracles, to heal people. How could they not do that unless they were beginning to become aware of God's divinity within them? In the Gospel of Acts, we read about the early disciples and the miracles that happened there. Again, as they lived into their full humanity in Jesus, they came to know their full divinity, and how it is that they too could be agents of the good news, because Jesus made it known to them. This season of Lent, I'm going to lead a series on forgiveness. I've casually named it, Let's Talk About Forgiveness. Because I believe there are things that we need to shed that keep us from hearing and or responding to Jesus' invitation to follow him. Deep, deep, deep down. When Jesus was in the wilderness, he went deep, deep, deep down into himself to where the suffering was, so that when he emerged from that time, he could more quickly and more easily see the suffering that he was called to respond to. We too are invited by Christ to go deep, deep, deep down into ourselves, to find our original blessedness, so that we might emerge capable of doing the work of God in the world, redeemed by God, all of our life redeemed. The brother whom I spoke about a moment ago, Sean Glenn, continued in a little piece that I was reading in anticipation of today with these words. We are living through a season in the world when the importance of this unique meeting of the finite and the infinite cannot be underestimated. I feel, Brother Glenn says, I feel the significance of the incarnation now more than ever. For as pandemic, social division, racism, and nationalisms threaten to divide the vibrant body of our humanity, this supreme gift of God invites us to reimagine our relationship to one another, our relationship to our bodies, our relationship to our nature, and to our destiny in a most unexpected way. My friends, our hearts have been broken this year. Over this last almost 12 months, our hearts have been broken again and again by the suffering we have known personally and the suffering we have witnessed of others. We are keenly aware of suffering. We may want to shut our eyes until it goes away. We may cling to our guilt or shame about the wrongs that we have done because we think somehow these will make us more holy. No, guilt and shame don't transform us. It's the love of God that transforms us. We need to let go of these things. We need to let go of those things that we cling to, perhaps ideas that we think will make the world better, and we need to let go of them and follow Jesus into the deep, deep, deep down work he is calling us to do, so that we might re-emerge into our life with all of it redeemed. And in celebration and glory of God, we will come to the end of this holy season saying, yes, yes, I have been brought into new life because of following Jesus. Amen.